Governor Bevin, Senator Bowen, Judge Executive Mattingly, Mayor Watson, and distinguished guests. Good morning and welcome. I'm Mark Martin, past board chair and current chair of the Greater Owensboro Chamber of Commerce Advocacy Committee. It is a pleasure for our chamber and for our community to have this opportunity to host Governor Bevin regarding this critical issue facing our Commonwealth. We are honored to have you here, Governor. Now, I'd like to introduce our state senator, Joe Bowen. Senator, maybe you'll get 2 rounds of applause. Senator, we know how tirelessly you have worked on this issue for years. We appreciate your hard work and your efforts on our behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, State Senator Joe Bowen.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Boy, it does feel good to get a round of applause. Those at times have been few and far between. But I want to welcome you all on behalf of all of us that have obviously been involved in this process. Before I go too far along, we've got a lot of elected officials here, and it would take a little bit of time to recognize each and every one of you. But the elected officials, if all of you would stand, I know our local delegation, Representative Matt Caslin, DJ Johnson, I don't know if Suzanne's in the crowd, or Robbie Mills. Anyway, our Frankfurt, okay, they're in Frankfurt today, but that's our local delegation. Thank you all for being here, and if you'd stand. There's a number of judges and city commissioners, county commissioners from across the region. If you would just stand and we can recognize you all, we appreciate you being here. Pam, good to see you all. You know, thank you all for being here. This is an important meeting, and it's important to me because I think the governor recognizes, because we have this conversation often, that there's a world west of I-65, and Governor Bevin realizes that. And today is witness to that fact, that he does recognize that there is a world west of I-65, and I rarely start a meeting in Frankfurt that I don't mention that this meeting's starting an hour earlier than, or, you know, I had to get up an hour earlier to make this meeting today because it's only 9 o'clock in Owensboro. But we are glad that the governor's here today. We're honored to have him here. Before I officially introduce him, I want to throw out some percentages for you. I want to throw out the percentage of 14%, the percentage of 54%, the percentage of 59%, the percentage of 30%. Now, if those were percentages of success in your businesses, you'd be broke. If those were the basketball coach's percentage of victories, he'd be fired. If those were test scores, you'd be failing. Those percentages, by any metrics, are failing numbers. Yet, those are the level of percentage of funding in each of our pension systems. This problem has been ignored for years, to the detriment of you folks that are actually in the systems and looking for a pension that you deserve. I wanted to spell that out, I wanted to highlight that, and I wanted to remind you, before I introduce the governor, that this attempt is to save those pension systems. Again, thank you all for being here. It's my honor to introduce our governor, my friend, Matt Bevin.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and I mean it for every single one of you. You could have been any number of places. Some of you truly had other places to be, were intending to be. This wasn't a lot of advance notice. We've been trying to run around the state and meet with folks in different areas to address this issue in person, to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So for those of you who literally had to change your schedule to be here, thank you. Some of you are retired and have a little more flexibility. Nonetheless, you took a beautiful day like today to be inside asking questions. Thank you as well. To those that were outside who met me, who were here to make a point and had signs and thought that they were here in protest, thank you for coming. I mean it sincerely, because the purpose of this is to answer questions, no matter whose questions they are, no matter what they're about, to talk about, as Senator Bowen just did, why we're even here. What is it that has forced this issue? So I'll touch on just a few things in general, and what I'll ask of you, there is a microphone here. If you're a person who's very quiet of voice, feel free to use that. Otherwise, if you, just to make it easier on you as we start to go forward, if you just have a question, just raise your hand, and I'll get to you as we move around. I'll repeat your question so that everybody can hear it. As long as I can hear it, I'll just repeat it so people understand it. So if you have a question, no matter where you are, just sound off of those and we'll go ahead and address them. But let me just back up just a little bit and speak to how it is that we even found ourselves here in the first place. I mean, these numbers that you just heard are real numbers. Every one of them, the highest first digit was a 5. Some of them remarkably, some of them a fraction of what the largest numbers were. If these were private sector plans, and you say, well, why does that matter? Let me explain something. There is no backstop for a publicly offered pension system, except the good faith, goodwill, and taxpayers' dollars. But there's a finite amount of those, whether we want to believe that or not. The federal government has the luxury of being able to print money. We don't. So a state has a certain amount of money it has, and that's all it has. And so a promise, no matter what that promise is only as good as the ability of the person who made the promise to deliver on it. That's just the harsh reality, but true enough. So how then do you guarantee that the promises that have been made can be delivered on? If in fact, as has been happening for a long time, people have been misled, if in fact numbers have been thrown out and promises have been made that people knew they couldn't fulfill, eventually that game has to stop. That gig has to end at some point. People have to be told the truth. When I was the only person running on either side that would put in writing what it was that they would do if they were elected. Some of you remember this, some of you may not. I put out something called a blueprint for a better Kentucky. You can go back and read it. It's still online somewhere. I'm sure you could Google it up. Blueprint for a better Kentucky. There were only 7 points in it. They were very specific. They were fiscal and financial in large measure, primarily because those are the things that affect all of us. Those are the things that allow us to be successful or not as a society. We have to be economically sound. It's the same for this city. It's the same for this state. It's the same for this region, this nation, whatever the case might be. So I was very specific, not only in what I put in writing, what I talked about at every pension stop that I came to. I was maybe in this room or some combination of this room a couple of years ago when I was meeting with a bunch of sheriffs, having this conversation. Every debate, we had this conversation. Every time it came up, I said very specifically, we are going to have to address this. People have not been shooting straight. People, for a variety of reasons, some intentional, some not intentional, some because they were informed, some because they were intentionally misinformed. But for a combination of reasons, from a variety of different sources, we have found ourselves in this position. But the point is, we've been misleading people with respect to the financial viability of our state. We have. Who hasn't been fooled? The credit rating agencies, Fitch's, S&P, Moody's. You say, well, who cares what they think? Well, you would care if it was your personal financial situation and you had to go get a loan somewhere. You wanted to buy a car or a house. If your credit rating is of no value to somebody, they're not going to lend you money. It's the same for a state. We have the worst credit rating of any state in America, minus a couple. There's only 3 or 4, depending on who's doing the rating, that have a lesser credit rating than we do. That means that our ability to even borrow is limited, and the cost at which we must borrow is higher than others. This ultimately comes at the expense of our ability to do the kind of things that we need and want to do to be viable and to grow. These are, again, harsh realities. We have been downgraded on multiple occasions in recent years by these credit rating agencies, Fitch's, S&P, and Moody's. They have, every time they've downgraded us, specifically mentioned, sometimes as the primary reason, the fact that we have the worst funded pension system in America. These numbers are correct, and I'll come back to that and why I was saying if this were the private sector. I'll come back to that in a moment. But you think about this. This is not something that we made up. It's not something we would wish on ourselves. But this is why we're having this frank conversation. It's why I ran on it. There were two reasons that I ran. This is the first political job that I've ever had. I didn't groom myself for this. I didn't aspire to this. I didn't say, hey, someday I want to be the guy standing in front of people and telling them the naked truth, which we largely know. This is like the emperor's new clothes. A lot of us for a long time in this state have recognized the emperor's naked. I'm the first person who's willing to stand up here and tell you straight up, straight out that he is. And we know it. And now what are we going to do about realizing that we have to respond to that reality? But I ran on this for two reasons. I ran to fix the pension system, and I ran to fix our broken adoption and foster care system in the state. Those are the two reasons I ran. I didn't need this job or want this job. I'm willing to do this job. And Lord knows it's not because it's a fun job. It's not because it makes everybody happy. It's not because you get a lot of good, positive, constructive feedback. I used to be able to go out to dinner with people and not have people come up and tell me I was evil. You know, that used to be able to happen. But the point is this. I did this willingly. I'm not surprised by it. I don't begrudge it. It's why I'm truly grateful when I hear people who agree and disagree but want to actually have a thoughtful conversation. That's what we should have. That's what good government looks like. So we had two things that I recognized among the many things that needed to be addressed that I truly believed if somebody took them head on, we could do something about. One was to save the pension system from failure. And as was noted by Senator Bowen, we have a failing grade, and it is fast devolving to abject failure. We'll come on back to that in a minute. The other was the foster care and adoption system. We have 8,500 plus kids in foster care. I'll spend just 1 minute on this. 2,400 plus are available for adoption right now. And the average kid waits almost 3 years after they're eligible to be able to be adopted. 2,400 kids. Not all of you are faith people of faith, but many of you are. Many in this state are. We have more than 6,000 churches alone, not to mention how many non-faith-based organizations care about this issue. I mean, if we can't find one home out of every 3 churches for a kid who's eligible and able and desirous of being adopted, shame on us. Shame on us. And if we don't fix a pension system that has a failing grade and is going to fail and is literally going to run out of money, and because we as a state don't have the ability to print money, and if we as a state sold everything we own, every state park, every building, every car, every pencil we owned, it wouldn't equal 10% of how much we owe in unfunded liability. Everything we own wouldn't come up to close to 10% of what we owe. And we don't have the ability to print it. And you can say, well, we'll just take it from people that are already here. Well, guess what? People can move, and they do. Businesses move right across these rivers to other places. People move right to other states. People with means have the ability to go and retire in other places, and they do, and they take their children and grandchildren with them. And if we recognize that and don't do something, shame on us there too. And this is why I ran. And this is why I have been so specific and so repetitive about the need to address this problem. Not because it was going to be fun, not because it was going to be easy, not because anybody under any circumstance in my mind were going to be happy to hear it, but because it absolutely needs to be addressed. So let me come back to the private sector that I was speaking about in a moment. There is in the private sector a number of defined benefit plans that still exist. There haven't been any really created in recent years for a variety of reasons we'll come to in a minute when we talk about demographics and how we found ourselves so severely underfunded. It's important for people to truly understand this. But there's something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, PBGC, you often hear it referred to as. By IRS statute, by federal law, if a state or a company, I should say, has a pension plan that is under 80% funded, it's considered in crisis. If it is 60% or below, and every one of these that was just alluded to is below that. By law, the federal government seizes that plan, shuts it down, and pays out anybody who was expecting to get anything out of it 15 cents on the dollar of what they thought they were going to get, and that's it. Then it's done. It's like the FDIC. Your bank account is insured against something, you get a certain amount, and that's it. It's backstopped by the people of America. It's the same for the PBGC. It's the same for private sector pension plans. Every single one of our plans would have been shut down. It would have been seized, and anyone who's a retiree or was hoping to be a retiree would have got 15 cents on the dollar at best, and that would be it. There is no equivalent in the public sector. Should there have been? Could there have been? Might there be in the future of necessity? Yes, yes, and yes, probably. But is there? No, there's not. So it's irrelevant to hypothesize about it. There isn't. But the fact is, we still have this obligation. We still owe many, many multiples of everything that we're bringing in. I don't care what number you use. The assumptions that people, you hear, well, it's 40 billion unfunded, it's 60, it's 80. It all depends on what variables you use. How much of an assumed rate of return? How much do you think the markets are going to contribute? How much do you think payroll growth is going to contribute? Depending on how you dial in those numbers, comes up with 40, 60, 80 billion dollars. A conservative blend of all of them, and truthfully, I think 80 is much more realistic, because 80 assumes if we only got the rate of return that we know we could get if we bought long-term treasury bills. To bet you're going to get a higher return than that when you're as severely underfunded as we are is a pretty big risk to take. And yet, let's just assume that we're pegging it to a 30-year treasury note and getting what we know we could get if we bought it, and assuming America doesn't go under, which increasingly with $20 trillion in debt is a stretch in its own right. But that said, let's assume that we're trusting the good faith and credit of the United States of America to pay back those bonds. If we used that as a rate of return, and we assume just a 0% payroll growth, when in fact for 10 straight years in this state, payroll growth has been declining because there's fewer and fewer workers in our systems, and we know that. Assuming just a flat payroll growth, not a declining one, which is what it is, just a flat one, and assuming just a 30-year treasury note return, which is as close as we can get to a guarantee, we have over an $80 billion unfunded liability if we use those two conservative assumptions. Others are telling you it's half that. Well, they have to use crazy assumptions to get to the point that it's half that, because if you assume higher rates of return, which are possible, sure it is. This year the markets are up. We've all remembered when they were down. On average, over time, they do okay. But depending on which assumptions you use, we are many times unfunded and in the hole the entire amount of money we bring in as a state every year. That's just, again, hard, fiscal, sad reality. We bring in $10, $11 billion, not counting monies that flow through from the federal government that are pre-designated for things. Medicaid and other entitlement reforms, Medicare and things of that sort. There's other dollars that come to the state, but not counting those. We don't have the ability to do anything with those other than put them to their intended use. But for the amounts that the state arguably has some control over, a significant portion of which are already spoken for, let's be honest, they are, whether it's through SEEK formula or Veterans Administration or for law enforcement or roads or whatever. The point is, a significant portion of our existing dollars are already largely spoken for, but they still equate to about $10 to $11 billion every year. So I don't care what number you use, 40, 60, 80. Let's assume it's in the middle and it's 60. You're talking 5 to 6 times what we bring in. If we just flash froze all of us, and nobody accrued another penny of obligation. Nobody got any older, nobody retired, nobody got sick. We just literally froze us in time, turned off all the lights, let everybody go for 5 or 6 years. And yet somehow people kept sending money in and got nothing in exchange. No law enforcement, no teachers, no roads, no lights, no administration, no paper processors, nothing. We gave them nothing in exchange for 5 to 6 straight years, but they kept paying 100% of what they're paying right now. No one left, and nobody did anything that would add anything to our cost and obligation. It would take 5 to 6 years of that, which is a ludicrous scenario, just to get back to ground level of what we owe, of what's unfunded. That's clearly impossible. It's literally impossible. This is the harsh reality that I am the bearer of, that others have seen to varying degrees. Some, in fairness, really didn't understand it. Some still don't understand it. Others saw it and intentionally disregarded it. Again, it doesn't matter, but this is where we are. It doesn't matter who was which and how much somebody did this, that, or the other thing. This is just the hard reality. So then it comes down to, how do you fix it? How did we get here? Let me touch on that quickly because everybody wants to know. I hear a lot of favorite theories as to how this happened. This money was stolen, this money was realigned, this money wasn't contributed when it was supposed to be. And there's some elements and basis of truth in almost everything you hear, but much of what you hear is actually not true. That's the sad reality. It is a combination of many things, not the least of which is actuarially required contributions. I hear some people say our legislature didn't put in the money they were supposed to. That's not true. It just isn't true. People could wish they had put more in, and indeed they could have put more in, which they did not, but they put in what they were required by law to do. And if people say, well, the law should have been different, maybe true, maybe so, but it wasn't. So we're dealing with reality, not with hypotheticals or what might have been. And indeed, the legislatures did put in what was required of them. The actuarially required contribution is not mandated to be paid in. Again, you could say, should have been, might have been, would have been if I'd been in charge, but again, it wasn't. It gave the option of maybe being contributed or maybe not. And because that was an option, and we'll come back to this in a moment, when I talk about how we're going to fix this, one of the ways we're going to do it is what's called level dollar funding, which will mandate that this be funded whether we want to or not. We don't get to may not. We will, by law. I'll come back to that. But that was part of it. I've put in the ARC each of the years that I've been governor. I said that I would when I was elected. I said we're going to fund the pension system. We're going to save it. That's the irony, is that myself and this administration, we're the whipping boys. We're the ones being attacked for actually doing what others have said they would do but never did. Nobody was upset with the people who lied. The liars, good, just keep lying to us. You deserve better than that if you're somebody who's in this system. You deserve better than that if you're not in the system, but you're paying for it as a taxpayer. Everybody in Kentucky deserves better than being lied to. So in 12 of the last 15 years, the ARC was not made. Wasn't required to be, and people chose to may not. But let me tell you something. Even if they had made, even if they had put in every single one of those, there were some who believed, see, then we'd be funded. We wouldn't. If we had put in every single ARC based on the assumptions that were being used, we would still be 84% of the hole that we're in right now. Every ARC contributed, and the compounding along the way, we would have filled 16% of the hole we're in right now. Again, however many tens of billions it is, you pick the number. 60? 84% of 60 is how much we'd be underfunded right now. That's the harsh reality of it. So 16% was not meeting all the ARCs along the way. Where'd the other 84% come from? How did we get here? We got here as a result of a couple things. The most powerful contributor that people should have seen, and I believe some did, but everybody ignored, was demographic reality. When these plans were put in place, you had 7, 8, 9 workers down here working somewhere between here and here. These are the retirees up here at the top. And you had 7 or 8 or 9 workers for every retiree. And then as people aged and more people retired, it was 6, 7, 8, 4, 5, 6, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1.5. We now have more retirees than workers in Kentucky. That's not a defined benefit system. These people who say, well, we need more people so that they can pay in to pay my benefits, that gig has been up for years. People are lying to you if they're not telling you that. That is not a pension system that works. That is an inverted wedge that's going to drive itself right into bankruptcy, and that's exactly what's happening. We don't like that. We wish it wasn't the case. We wish somebody had sounded this alarm 20 years ago, but they didn't. And those that did were ignored because some have. This is where we are. You cannot run a system like we have with fewer people working than are retired. You just can't. It does not work mathematically. You can't spend money you don't have. So given that reality, that's another contributor. Another big contributor has been the fact that we've used false assumptions, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. We assumed rates of return that we would get from the investment of these dollars that has never happened. I find it interesting that I hear from a lot of people, well, don't put me into a DC plan. I don't want my money gambled in the stock market. Where do you think your current retirement is invested? In the stock market. It always has been. It's why I say if you want to really see what your obligation is, tie it to something that's more stable, like a 30-year Treasury note, but nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to assume higher rates of return, and indeed, hopefully you get higher rates of return, and historically you have gotten higher rates of return over time in the markets. And yet, people have assumed higher rates of return than we've actually gotten. And because they've assumed higher rates of return, if you assume you're going to get more from the market, that means you have to do what as a legislature in terms of funding? Put in more or less? Less. Think about it. If you assume you're going to get more from here, you put in less from here. So everyone liked the idea of assuming higher rates of return. It sounded good. The itching ears got what they wanted to hear. Oh, we're going to get that kind of good, so we won't have to put as much money in. People also assumed, well, we'll have growth in payroll. More people working at higher wages. How many of you, I won't make you raise hands, but if you're public employees or retired public employees, remember all those pay raises you kept getting? Remember those? Oh yeah, you didn't. Payroll growth wasn't expanding. Oh, and in fact, you remember how you kept having so many people in the office, you didn't know how you were going to get all the work, divvied up because there was so many people and not enough work? Remember that? Oh yeah, it was the exact opposite. You found yourself with every passing year working with fewer and fewer employees because there were not only fewer people, but you weren't getting pay increases. So guess what? Payroll growth was not growing by 4%, which is what has been assumed for years in this state. We've been assuming that it's growing by 4% when everyone knew that was a lie. Everyone knew that was not true. Because you could literally look every single year at whether it was growing or not, and it wasn't. For the last 10 straight years, under Republicans, under Democrats, under this administration, the one that preceded me for 8 years and the one before that, it has been declining. And yet we assumed that it was expanding. Well, guess what? If more people are paying in the assumption, what does the government have to do? Pay in more or less? Less. So we kept assuming more from places, some of which we couldn't have predicted. You can't predict with a crystal ball what's going to happen in the market, but you do know for a straight up fact whether or not payroll growth is growing or shrinking. And we assumed more than we should have here, even though year after year after year we failed to meet the expectation in terms of market return. And we assumed more than we should have because we knew straight up that it wasn't true in terms of payroll growth. And because we assumed more on both of those, we kept putting less in. That's how we came to this problem. It didn't get done by one person. It didn't get done by one party. It didn't get done by one legislature. It didn't get done by one thing. It got done by death by 1,000 cuts for the last 20 years. And all those things are why we are where we are. Does anyone like it? No. Does everybody wish we could have a do-over? Yes. But life doesn't work that way. You don't get a mulligan on bad financial decisions. You don't. And so this is where we are. So what do we do about it? How do you, again, when I came in, some of the signs that were said and some of the comments that have been made and why I bet most of you are here is because you want to know how are we going to keep the promises that have been made to people. That's the $64,000 question or the $64 billion question, as the case might be. How do you do that in light of the fiscal reality that I have just shared with you? And some of you, the things that I've shared with you, you know. But for the vast majority, you don't know that. And why would you? It would be like me being an expert in whatever your world is. One of the reasons I ran on this, the reason this was a reason that I said I'm willing to be the governor and to take this head on, is I knew it was failing. I knew it was. Why? Because I'm blessed to have been a person who's worked in this world and lived in this world. I've seen it. I've lived the American dream. I'm very fortunate. A lot of you are aware of this. I grew up well below the poverty level. Family of 8. My father never made 20 grand. We didn't have 2 cents to spend on anything. I never had health care of any kind in my life or access to it till I was an active duty military officer in my 20s. We drove around in $100 rusted out cars. So the people that we talk about, and it's true enough, that what about these people who are banking on this and are counting? I know those people. There's 3 generations of my family, that ahead of me, that of my parents, and that of 2 of my siblings, who have degrees in public education, who have been teachers in the public schools, some of whom have graduate level degrees in public education. All these things That people think, well, this governor and this administration and this legislature, they don't get it. They don't understand. Baloney. I don't just have sympathy for it, I have empathy for it, and there's a big difference between the two. Sympathy is you emotionally feel sorry for somebody. Empathy is you literally know what they're going through because you've experienced it. This is why I was willing to take this kind of grief to actually fix this problem. Because I know how critical it is that we actually be honest with people and come up with a way to keep this promise. So how do you do it? How do you actually keep a promise that others have for decades been misleading people about the ability to keep? We are where we are whether we like it or not. The one thing that has been done that I want to clarify, there's many who have said, well, gee, now that we have an idea out there, we have a plan, now we need to get input from all these different groups that are affected by it and see what they say. That's a good point. That's why we've been doing exactly that for months. I've personally met with, name a group, name any group. The FOP, the KEA, the retired teachers, the jailers, pick a group, any group you could imagine that has a vested interest in this. We've had multiple face-to-face meetings with over the last several months. Multiple. Many of them I've personally had. I guarantee you, the KEA, for example, which has been a vocal, participant in this process, and I appreciate that they do. They represent a whole lot of people who touch pretty much everybody in the state, and they ought to be vocal. That's what they're there for. I guarantee you they have never had as much face-to-face time with the governor ever as they've had with me. Would bet on it. The point is, governors have never sat down with these groups, let alone for hours on end. And anybody who would lead you to believe that their voice hasn't been heard is lying to you straight up. The guy who's the head of superintendents sent out a letter recently to other superintendents telling them they need to shut down the schools so people can protest what's being done, saying the reason he sent that out when he was asked by the media, why did you send out a letter like that? He said, well, our voice hasn't been heard. He has personally met with me and my team 5 times or more. He's lying to you. Don't let people lie to you like they've lied to you thus far. Does that mean his reasoning for wanting to have this addressed is wrong? No, but the methodology should be factual. The approach to this should be civil discourse. As somebody said when we were outside on our way in here, we should be able to have civil discourse. We should have it based on facts. So how are we going to do this? The months and months and months that we have been addressing this, meeting for hundreds of hours with all of these different groups that represent active public employees and retired public employees. Multiple meetings. And the double-digit number of meetings, I don't even know how many we've had with House and Senate leadership. For 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 hours at a time. Weekdays, weeknights, weekends. You know how many Sunday afternoons and evenings many of your leadership in the House and Senate have spent working on this issue all summer long? This idea that this just kind of popped out and now, this is literally the culmination of all these meetings. Is it a perfect plan? Of course it's not. Is it possible to come up with a perfect plan? Of course it's not. Is this the only plan that will ever address this situation now and forevermore? And if we lock this in, nothing ever could be discussed again? Of course it's not. Is the alternative of doing nothing because we can't have a perfect plan, a good one? Of course it's not. Failure to act is a guarantee that the system will fail. You want to guarantee how you're not going to keep the promise? You keep kicking this can. You keep ignoring the reality of what's coming. The largest of the plans, which has far more retirees than active workers right now, the KERS non-hazardous plan, will fail in the next handful of years. 3, 5, 6, I don't know. Depends on what happens in the markets. But last year, for example, a full third of it. When you pay out $1 billion and you end the year with 1.9, do the math on that one. Yes, some money's coming in. Yes, you'll get some appreciation in the market. But when you have 1.9 left after you just spent 1, you only have a handful of years before you bleed out. That one will fail first. So KERS non-hazardous will go, and then these other ones that have increasingly higher numbers, They'll fail in some years after that. And if you think, well, that if they have 3 to 5 years, the other ones have 12 to 15 years, I wouldn't bet on it. KERS non-hazardous 10 years ago was more fully funded than any of those plans that Senator Bowen just talked about. It had a higher rate of funding. It was more well-funded than any plan that exists right now in Kentucky 10 years ago. This happens like that because it is what Forbes, among others, when they look at states, and ours among them, they refer to Kentucky and have for some years, which is why people should have known and have known in some cases what's coming. They've been referring to us as a death spiral state. Why do they say that? Because that's exactly what we're in. Once the gig is up, once the system is insolvent, once you have more retirees than workers, once you've made assumptions for an extended period of time that are faulty, the system is broken. It is broken. The only way back, and this is the third or fourth time I've asked the question now without answering, how then do you save the system? It's on the backs of everybody who pays taxes. That's it. And when I hear people say you're trying to fix the system on the back of this group or that group or these employees or that employees, nonsense. Are they being asked to contribute? You bet. But guess who else is? The 90-something% of Kentuckians who aren't in these systems and are never going to be in these systems. They're also being asked to participate, and truth be told, they're being asked to participate a whole lot more proportionally because they literally get nothing out of it personally. What they do get is the services and provision of services provided by people who are teachers and law enforcement officers, and you bet we need those things, and we want those things, so you bet we're getting value, but not personally. When people say you're taking it out of my pocket as an employee, and you're taking money from my pocket, you shouldn't be doing that. Well, we're taking money from everyone's pocket. Everyone. If you're a taxpayer in this state, you are going to be obligated. So let me come back to something I mentioned earlier. How do you pay this off? How do you fix it? How do you keep the promise? This level dollar funding that I mentioned is something that has never been required in the past. This is part of how we got into this problem. If we had paid our freight every time along the way, we wouldn't be in this problem. But we didn't. And we allowed ourselves to be tricked, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, but we did. And now we've dug ourselves into a deep hole. How do we get out? You figure out how deep the hole is. And we have done that. We did pay actuaries to literally audit every one of the plans, and we've come up with a pretty clear idea of what the obligation is. And again, even that is to say that people still disagree on what assumptions. And some say it's 40, and some say it's 60, and some say it's 80. Again, there's still disagreement, but in general, we know roughly where it is. So take that middle of the road. Take that assumption of 60. I truly would rather err on the side of 80, but it will make the solution even more expensive for taxpayers. But let's just say it's 60, which is frankly modest, and I think, if anything, still a little bit generous in terms of the assumptions. But let's say it's that. That means that we owe essentially $2 billion a year for the next 30 years. And let me digress for one quick second, and I'll come back to that. I hear people say, well, we need to legalize marijuana in this state because we'll get $100 million in tax money. Yeah, the people of Kentucky will have to smoke pot and pay taxes on it for 600 years to pay that off. I mean, seriously, that's a ridiculous suggestion. I mean, I appreciate that it's a suggestion, but it's not even close to being able to fix this problem. The same for casino gambling and other things, which these things are suckers' bets. They sound great, but all that glitters is not gold. We are going to absolutely need to, and I'll tell you, this is a whole topic. We could have a 14-hour conversation on this subject that I'll just touch on here. We absolutely need to relook at our tax code in this state, period. We just do. I've been clear about that time and time again. It's antiquated, it's outdated, it's counterproductive, it's uncompetitive. That's a whole nother topic. Clearly, that's going to be a contributor. It has to be. It is already. That's where the money comes from. But the fact is, where are we going to come up with $2 billion a year? That's being conservative. And that's assuming there's no growth, no depreciation due to inflation, no increased cost due to increase in health care or whatever the case might be. Bear in mind as well, all these dollars I'm talking about, 40, 60, 80, pick your number. Not one of those numbers, not any of the numbers you hear being discussed in private conversation or with the media or anyone else, not one of those numbers takes into consideration the cost of providing health care to retirees. That's a whole separate problem. And guess what? That's billions of dollars underfunded as well. 6 to 8 billion just for that. That's a whole nother area. Let's leave that alone for now and pretend that's not a problem, because it's only 10% the problem of the problem we're talking about. Where do we get $2 billion? We get it from taxpayers. That's where it's always come from. That's where it's going to come from again. That's about 20% of our current annual income as a state. Think about that. Last time, in the last budget, I put in $1.2 billion into the pension system for each of the last 2 years. That created, if you remember and were paying attention, a fair bit of angst among a whole lot of people. A lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. We had to cut. We had to cut 9% out of some things, 4.5% out of others. Some were exempted. But to come up with $1.2 billion, we had to cut like we've never cut before. It's why we put more money in than has ever been put in before. And yet that 1.2 in relation to 60 plus is just a drop in the bucket. I heard from people saying, well, it's a good thing we fixed that. We didn't fix diddly. We just stopped bleeding as hard for 1 year, and now it's second year. But here's what we have to realize. That entire 1.2 is we're going to have to come up with roughly another 800. We're going to have to keep doing that. Oh, and guess what? The cuts that allowed us to do that have already been made. We don't get to add the fat back to cut it again to find the savings. We have to keep the 1.2, which we sort of have locked in due to the previous cuts, but guess what? We need another 800 or so, being conservative, on top of that every single year. Where's it going to come from? We don't get to print it. We can't force people to come here. We can't force companies to expand here. We can't force people to retire here. Where's it going to come from? These are questions people don't want to ask because they don't want the answer. The answer is it's coming from the taxpayers that have no choice but to be here, and many do. And many businesses have a choice. And they look at the credit rating of states, and they look at the viability of communities, and whether a community in its own jurisdiction can actually pay its bills, because no smart employer wants to go put capital expenditures and investment into the ground and build a building and hire people in a community where the community's bleeding out, because they know they're going to be left holding the bag, and nobody wants to be left holding the bag. That's the reality. So given that reality, what can we do? We suck it up is what we do. And we have shared sacrifice is what we do. And we do look at every option for paying 20% of our entire intake for what affects, and people don't like this, but I'm telling you what concerns me, and one of the reasons I'm challenging this, is if this did fail. If I'm the last governor that could kick this. There's one kick left before the first system fails. That's a fact. And there's nobody who knows anything about actuarial reality or finances that will tell you otherwise, and be honest with you. There's one kick left for the KERS non-hazardous plan. I could kick it, go around, cut ribbons, eat some barbecue, have a good time, and sail the heck on out of here. I'm not going to do that. I didn't run to do that. I'm not going to do it. But it is going to implode. So how do you keep that from happening? You basically have shared sacrifice, and everybody sucks it up, and we all pitch in. This is a reality. What I don't want to see happen is to have class warfare, and by class warfare, I'm talking about the 90-something% of people that are paying for the single-digit percentage of people that we're talking about here. And if you think there's anger and resentment among the single-digit percentage who do important jobs, and no one questions that, no one's questioning the value of a prison guard or a law enforcement officer or a teacher or a construction worker or a fill-in-the-blank. Nobody questions the value in the input, in the importance, in the necessity of that. But that is a single-digit percentage of the people in the state that are working. And if it now isn't just 10 or 20, but becomes 30 and 40 and 50%, which is what we're trending toward if we don't structurally address this, do you think the 90-something% are not going to get outraged at a certain point? Do you think you're not? It's already starting to happen. Trust me, I hear it. And shame on us if we allow that to happen. That's an abdication of responsibility on the part of those of us that you elected to go and fix this problem. This is the time for the big pants to be put on and for the adults to come into the room and make hard decisions. Because that's exactly where we are. And we are trending from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40. Those of you in county government see this already. Statutorily, You are required next year, if you're in county or local government, you're going to see your non-hazardous contributions increase by 50%. And for your hazard duty folks by 60%. So if you think your budget is constrained now in your communities, imagine that you're now 50 to 60% more constrained. That's next year alone, guaranteed, not hypothetical, statutorily 100% guarantee that you're going to see that contribution go up. If we don't pass this bill, which actually accounts for the fact that nobody, with rare exception, has the money to make that increase. There's a handful of cities and or counties in the state, a handful, literally probably you could count them on one hand, that could afford to make that kind of a contribution next year. Which is why in this bill we recognize that and say in 2019, we're going to hold it flat, that what you're currently paying will not go up in fiscal year 19. Some of you very quickly and astutely are going, well, there's a can kick right there. You're exactly right. But let me come back to why. In year 2, 2020, it says the increase between what you're now paying and what you really need to pay to make the true arc and mandatorily do it with level dollar funding by breaking it into 30 pieces and funding it in full, that in 2020, you'll go 1/3 of the difference. In 2021, fiscal year 2021, which starts in the summer of 2020, you go to 2/3. And by fiscal year 2022, you go to 100% of the difference between where we are now, the 1.2, and the essentially $2 billion that it's going to cost. We essentially built that in because we know these cities and counties can't afford to do it now. And in fairness, and this is about the only nod, I don't make decisions based on political expediency. Perhaps you've noticed that. Only an idiot would run for office saying they're going to do this and then actually do it if they were thinking they were going to build a political career. I'm not doing this to build a political career. I'm doing it because it needs to be done, because I have 9 children, and I want my kids to live in Kentucky, and I don't want this place to bleed out. That's why I'm doing it. But I'll tell you this, the only nod to political reality is, could you imagine if you know for a fact that starting next summer, your cost of doing everything are going up 50 to 60% as it relates to all the people that you employ in every facet of government? Could you imagine running for re-election in 2018 saying, oh, hey, starting next summer, a few months before you vote for me, I'm cutting 1/3 of all the people who work for this city, 1/3 of all the people who work for this county? You're going to find some person who doesn't know anything but will say, well, I'll just vote for me and I won't do that. And people will vote for that person because people wish that reality was not reality, and they'll vote accordingly. The reason we're waiving it for 1 year is so that people know exactly what's coming in years 2, 3, 4, and beyond. And the people that are bold enough and wise enough and convicted enough to run anyway will be the ones that run. And the people will have time to digest and choose wisely the people who have what it takes to be financially responsible. That's why we're doing this. That's why we've built into this a feathering in process. It's why, again, I come back to what I said in the beginning. This idea that this just got pulled out of the air, and this is my idea or someone else's idea or Joe's idea or somebody's nonsense. This is the collective effort of thousands of hours, hundreds of hours of specific meetings, all in combination coming up with something that started out very differently. As Senator Bowen will tell you, it went through a whole lot of machinations, and it kept being changed every time we met with a group. Both active employees and retirees. Every time we met with a group, the thing began to change. And it began to morph. And so extensions were made. Let me talk about teachers, for example, because it's topical. 38% of them have 5 years or less. Interestingly, for those of you that are teachers or have been teachers, you know that in the first 5 years, essentially, you're not vested. It's the equivalent of being sort of a tier 3 employee or whatever the case might be. You don't have the stake in a system and in a plan that you would if you'd been there longer than that. By law, inviolable contract or otherwise, they don't have the rights that those that have been there 5 years or more have. That's just reality. It would have been absolutely legal and arguably financially prudent to say for those 38% of teachers that they're just going to be treated as people who have no rights, and they're going to go straight into a DC plan whether they like it or not. That is absolutely, people could have sued all day long. It wouldn't have made a lick's worth of difference. But the decision, based on all the feedback from so many groups, was specifically for that group, that wasn't what we're going to do. That if a person's in their first year as a teacher, and expected to be able to work for 27 years and get a defined benefit for the rest of their life based on those years of service, then that's exactly what we're going to give them. Why? Because it's obligated legally? No. But morally, I don't even know if it's a moral issue. It was ultimately decided it was the right thing to do. Those are the kind of conversations that have been happening for months. The same could be said for any other number of groups. Pick one. Where people started and where we ended up. Why does this look so different than what the consultants recommended, the people who audited the plans and were paid to give us objective, non-personally binding advice? They gave us suggestions they said take back COLAs. They were never accounted for. They were never accrued for. They said take those back. They never should have been paid. It was illegal, and indeed it was. It's not in any contract anywhere. But the reality is people have made an adjustment, and somebody who's now making $2,800 a month, and if you suddenly took it back, would be making $2,200 a month. I'm just picking numbers. That's a pretty dramatic change. That is more of a moral issue. So again, the legislators said we're not going to do that to people. Do we have every legal right to do it? Yes. Is it financially appropriate? Yes. Is it the right thing to do? No. So we're not going to do it. That's why this plan, while not perfect, and while not giving everybody exactly what they want, gives far more to people than could have been done and financially ought to be done. This proposal that we have put out there is a 30-plus year fix. It will take 4 years just to phase in the true starting to pay, and from that point forward, paying the full tranche each time, the level dollar funding, another 30 years on top of that. This is a 34-year fix that we're talking about. Some of us in this room won't be living when this finally gets paid off. Some will. And the reality is, if we don't do this, it will fail. And we do not have an option for where to come up with the money once it fails. And the promises, people say, well, the promise is made, they better send me the check. They'll send you the check, it just won't clear. So what good is it? A lie is a lie. An empty promise is a lie. And whether someone meant to give it to you, knew they were giving it to you, it doesn't matter. If there's no money in the bank and there's nowhere to get the money to put in the bank, then those checks will not clear. This is where we are. So forgive me, I was going to say just a couple things and then take your questions. I hope I've laid out for you in some measure how we got to where we are, why we got to where we are. And with that said, what questions on any front, ideally related to this, and if there are truly none on this, I'll answer questions about anything. But I'm guessing you came here to talk about the pensions. So what questions? Yes, ma'am. And I'll repeat the questions.
So I'm not anyone that works for the state, and I'm someone that doesn't know anything about accounting, so this may be a stupid question.
It's all right.
But knowing that we're all invested in this together, and we all have to do our part to fix it, knowing that that is going to cause a decrease in someone's salary, whether it's now or 30 years down the road, what are the plans to increase for the money in terms of, like, trying to say, of giving back in a different way? For instance, if we're worrying about people leaving the state of Kentucky, well, if all these things happen and we're having to give, if there isn't something that's coming in on the other end, so, I mean, are there plans or?
Yes, I'll try to consolidate and tell me if I've captured your question. It's a how given the reality that we've laid out, in the financial reality of it, and the need for shared sacrifice and people's willingness, to be a participant, nonetheless, how do you guarantee that there's going to be money coming back in? Where do we're talking about what's going out, what's coming out of people's pocket, how people are going to have to sacrifice. How do we offset that, I think, is the question you're asking. Where does that come from? This is what economic development is about, which is why, ironically, it's this crazy, vicious cycle. If you're a state that is considered a risk to invest in, people don't invest in it. If they invest somewhere else, what happens when they do that? The jobs go there. And when people do those jobs and they earn those wages and they pay taxes on those wages and they buy goods and services, they're not doing it here, they're doing it somewhere else. And all the tax benefit from those opportunities happens somewhere else. And if we have a low credit rating, the dollars do go somewhere else. Here's the irony. If you go back a couple generations, there's people even in this room that in your lifetimes, the size of Tennessee, Indiana, and Kentucky were remarkably close together in terms of population. We're almost the same size as each other in terms of land mass. We're literally sequentially, I think 34th, 5th, and 6th, or 5th, 6th, and 7th, or something like that. We're almost the same size. And it wasn't too many generations ago that we were actually similar in population. Now both those states have 2 million more people than us. Tennessee is now bigger than Indiana. It's been growing like this. Why? It wasn't long ago that Tennessee and Kentucky kind of followed a similar suit. Why? Because they've gotten their house in order, and they've made fiscal decisions, and they've made labor decisions, and they've made tort reform decisions, and they've made the kind of decisions you elect people to go to Frankfurt to do that too often, historically, many who preceded me in this office specifically have ignored because they're hard, they're not easy. But because we've ignored it, other people have passed us by. Could you imagine if we had 2 million more people in the state? We have room for them. We have more arable land than Tennessee does. I mean, especially in this part, especially west of I-65. This area is ripe. You wouldn't even see a dramatic change in terms of the quality of life, and you could have an inordinate number of people. You're starting to see this happen as we've connected the spur up here. What's going to happen in towns like Owensboro will be transformative. That's how you change it. That's where the money comes from. Imagine if we had 2 million more people, and imagine if just 30% of them, again being fairly conservative, were taxpayers. Just 3 out of every 10 of the next 2 million people that came were taxpayers. Could you imagine what 600,000 more taxpayers in Kentucky would mean to our ability to give pay raises to teachers and law enforcement officers and prison guards and social workers and highway workers and fill in the blank, let alone to meet our obligations? It would make all the difference in the world. We should be encouraged by the fact and sobered by the fact. And maybe I touched on this, and forgive me if I'm being repetitive. I know I said the first part. I don't know if I said the second part. We've been downgraded repeatedly by these credit rating agencies because of this problem. But 2 of the 3 major credit rating agencies, since we announced the proposal that we are going to address this, it's not even passed into law yet. 2 of them have come out and written favorably about their reaction to this, saying the devil's in the details. We'll wait till it's done, but this is exactly the kind of thing we've been calling for. This is the kind of thing that changes that trajectory and causes it to do this. That's why Indiana and Tennessee have better credit ratings than this. I mean, literally, I live in the Louisville area. Indiana buys full-size billboards, half the size of this room, that talk about how they're a AAA rated state. Come do business in our state. And guess what? People can drive across a brand new $1 billion bridge and do it, and they are. They are, because they're not kept here. This isn't East Berlin. We don't get to force people to stay here. And so other states come in and literally cherry pick and brag about the fact that they got their house in order. That's how it has to change. But where does it start? What's the chicken? What's the egg? The credit rating agencies aren't going to give us the credit rating based on the possibility that we'll do the right thing in the future. They're waiting for us to do the right thing, things like this, acknowledge that we're bleeding out and do something about it. And in response to us doing something about it, then you start to get the credit rating that then attracts the kind of business. I have conversations with business leaders all the time. I met with a group last night. They're looking to make a $300 million investment west of I-65. They may or may not make it. Guess who it's down to? Us in Indiana. I have to do my best, make my best case. In short of, tap dancing, I do the best I can. But it's not lost on them. It will be $80 million more expensive for a variety of reasons, the details of which don't matter, for them to do what they're thinking of doing here versus Indiana. If you were that company, and it would cost you $80 million more to do it in Kentucky versus Indiana, where would you likely go? Probably not here. And yet there are certain things that we have the ability to make the case for that I think are advantages. And so my job is to sell the blazes out of those. And we have great advantages. But it's hard for me to do that against a state that has its house in order. And Indiana, let's not kid ourselves, they're only 12 years ahead of us. That's all. 12 years ago, they elected Mitch Daniels. They were in as bad a shape as we were. And for the last 12 years, then followed by him, Mike Pence, and now Eric Holcomb, they're on track to get their house in order and do a good job, and they're doing a good job. And so as a result of that, they're 12 years ahead of us. We can do the same thing. But every day, it may not be $300 million, but we get 13 new legitimate business opportunities in our economic development cabinet every week. 13 every week. Think about that. There's some small, some large. These are the kind of things that we need to pursue these. $300 million capital investment in stage 1. Then they have a stage 2 and stage 3 that they would hope would come 2 years and 2 years after that to be $600 million. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, average income of well north of $70,000. You think we don't want that company west of I-65? You bet we do. Is it hard for me to make that case relative to states that have their house in order? Yes, it is. So where's the chicken and where's the egg? Where does it start and where does it end? That is the $64 billion question. But this is exactly why we are doing what we're doing. Not because we want to, but because we have to. Other questions from anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Honorable representatives, just to have a follow-up on her question. So specifically, how, and what you said was very well explained, quite honestly speaking, but specifically to answer the question, how do we help those that will be affected with their pay cuts, so to speak? How can we offset that so they can have that incentive to stay here? Because, we love the city and we love our state. And we want to do as much as we can for, representatives.
I am very grateful that you came in and that you asked this question, because I forgot to answer that part of your question, which is actually a false premise on both your parts, intentionally or otherwise. I'm thinking not. And so I'm glad you asked it. The question is, how is it that in light of the pay cuts that we're taking from people, how is it that we can create an environment in which people would still want to live here? Because people do want to live here. I want to clear something up. There is nowhere in this proposal, nor has it been a conversation at any turn, that we are cutting anyone's pay. There has been a conflation of two things that have led people to say, well, it's the same thing. And let me be very clear as to what that is. But there is no proposal that anybody's, retired or otherwise, is seeing a cut in their current pay. Zero such proposal. It's nowhere in this bill. It has never been discussed. Anyone who tells you otherwise is, again, not shooting straight with you. But there is some misunderstanding, and specifically around the number. If I asked you to give a number of what you are thinking of, it would probably rhyme with 3. Because people hear about this 3% state pay cut. And that is a conflation of two things. In this proposal, there is an ask of current employees to contribute 3% of their current pay toward their future health care retirement benefit. That is true. Now, and it's a very fair argument to say, well, that's the same as a pay cut because it was 3% I had and now 3% I don't. But it's not a pay cut. We're not taking somebody's pay down. We're just taking 3% of it under this proposal that would be applied toward a future benefit. And again, I say this just as harsh reality. Any of you that are not in a public sector, any of you that are not on a public benefit as a retiree or getting health care through a benefit that was paid by the state, if you have health care coverage, I'm willing to bet that in recent years you've seen more than a 3% increase in your cost of coverage. I'm betting you have. It's gone up exponentially. In fact, many of you, if yours is at all like mine, has gone up 2 and 3 times in recent years. 2 and 300%, not 3%. This 3% is real money. This isn't to be dismissive of that in any way, shape, or form. And I was in a forum earlier today in Eastern Kentucky talking to a group of folks where they're even more financially constrained than folks are blessed to be on this side of the state. And for them, and this person made the very compelling case, that 3% is a powerful, powerful impact. Absolutely understood. There's no question about that. But the point is, the value of what someone wants, which is a health care benefit for life, is also worth something. And for some people, again, depending on tiers, and depending on, tier this and tier that, some of you know what this means. I won't explain it all. Depends on when you came into which system as to what tier you're in. But there are some people who are paying nothing in for the benefit that they will receive. It's arguable as to the value of what that benefit is. We don't know what it will be. But we know that the cost of health care is not going down. Hasn't been and isn't likely to in the foreseeable future. Given that reality, the value of it to someone for the rest of their life in retirement will be worth something. And asking people to pay something for the value that they will receive is a very reasonable expectation. It's what others have to do that are not covered by such a plan. It's not a pay cut. It is a contribution of one's pay toward a benefit that that individual will be the sole recipient of. They're paying into the future for something that they will get value of, and truth be told, that 3% won't come close to the value of what it will be. It won't. They will derive back, without question, more, unless they die. And again, you can't predict that, but assuming they live a healthy, normal, expected life of an average retired person, they will receive more in return than they will have ever paid in, including compounding and accruing and accounting for the growth of that investment. They will, which means that too is backstopped by the other 90-something% of people. Nobody is receiving a pay cut. Everyone is being asked to contribute, if they're an active worker, for 3% toward their future health care benefit. And let me remind you, and I think I mentioned this, and again, forgive me if I'm being redundant. These meetings, you all are beautiful people, but there's beautiful people everywhere. You all start to blend together. But I will say this. The monies that we've talked about, the tens and tens of billions of unfunded liability, do not account for the unfunded status of our health care retirement benefits. We're 6 to 8 billion underfunded in those. Depending on when people retired and which plan they retired under, they have very, very good health care, or some that's less than very, very good, but still decent, and or contributions toward, on a monthly basis, of some hundreds of dollars that they can contribute toward the purchase of health care. Every one of them has some such benefit. We have not had a lot of increases over time in terms of people's contribution toward that. Meanwhile, the cost of the provision of it has gone up and up and up, and which is part of why our underfunded status in those plans is now billions and billions of dollars. And because it's billions and billions of dollars, this is a way to say we're going to end up, if we don't get ahead of this, in the exact same position we are with all this other issue on that front alone. You may now be getting your check if we fix this, but if we don't address the fact that the health care program, which is separate, that has different pools of money invested in different ways to be able to provide that health benefit, they too are bleeding out. And if we don't address that, then soon enough you may get a check, but you won't have health care. And people have promised both. So to keep the promise, we have to have a way to pay for it. We just do. So I hope that clarifies. Nobody is receiving a pay cut. People are being asked to contribute a portion of what they receive for a benefit that they will get. And people say, well, people will steal that money. They'll sweep that money. You cannot. Any more than you can sweep money out of these pension systems. Any argument that that has been done is not true. People hypothesize on that because this state has been notorious for sweeping money. There are many places you can sweep money. You can sweep money out of a whole lot of things. You cannot sweep them out of a plan that by law is set up to provide a retirement benefit. You literally cannot do that. And so these dollars that would be received, these 3% that would go into paying a benefit that someone gets out, it is not possible that those can be realigned to anything else. It's not. And so those monies really would go there. That's why they're being asked for. It's to ensure that that benefit is also there for people. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Governor.
Hey.
Dick Brayton, I'm the superintendent here in the city schools. Let me first say we appreciate your courage, your conviction, your commitment to this, because we know, and all of us want this to go away. We want it to get fixed. I want to ask a question on two fronts. The first question really relates to the return to work provisions. Some of the return to work provisions in the proposal, in a community like this where we've had some great second career folks that have come and made significant contributions, it seems to me that some of those return to work provisions would be more expensive. They wouldn't save money. We've got several examples in our system, and it also would seem to me that some of that would drive people out of state, particularly a state that shares so many borders with other states. The second question relates to, in this proposal, we haven't seen numbers yet, And I know there's been some advocation for shared responsibility to fix the existing system compared to moving to an entirely new approach, and an approach that still doesn't use Social Security. With or without Social Security, there's a speculation that this is going to be much more expensive than just fixing our system.
Okay, let me try to get them. I remember the second one. I've already forgotten the first one. Remind me the first one real quick was the return to work provision. Let me touch on that, and then we'll come back to the Social Security as it applies or doesn't apply, et cetera. For the return to work, one of the things that has led to an actuarially unsound system is the fact that people historically used to be able to, and this is not what you're speaking to, but there used to be triple dipping, double dipping people that would retire from the government and then go back and get another job, earn another pension, retire from that, be pulling a pension while working. That has ended. It ended some time ago. You can no longer earn two pensions from the state. Some people have them. They didn't get taken back, but the point is you can't do that going forward. Even so, the idea that a person can retire and then go back, sometimes in their very same job they were in, and keep doing that same job at the same or maybe even higher pay because now you don't have to pay their benefits because they already have them as a retiree, is a very tempting thing for a local or county jurisdiction to hire such a person. A, they're qualified. B, they're able. They know the job, and they're cheaper, and you can give them more money. But it actually the question is this: is it an appropriate structure to allow that person to do this at the expense of someone else who may need and want a job in the community? You mentioned that there are certain areas where it is a necessity, and you're right. Ask anybody who hires a deputy sheriff. Ask anybody who hires a substitute teacher. Ask anybody who looks for a school bus driver. Those are just three examples of exactly the kind of people who 90% of them, I bet, were previously a state employee. The vast majority of them are, certainly. And they go back into jobs like that. It's why in this bill, again, based on a lot of input from a lot of people over months and months, what was originally the determination, again, people in the beginning are putting this idea and that idea against the wall. What was initially the idea that if you retire from state government, you shouldn't be allowed to go back in and earn another benefit from another paycheck from state government if you're already pulling simultaneously a pension from the very same people. But then people started to bring up some of these examples, and they're valid, and it's true. We'd be hard-pressed to find substitute teachers and school bus drivers and deputy sheriffs, among others. So then the determination is, well, how do you accommodate for that? Some people measure things in a number of hours worked. With teachers, it's numbers of days worked. And so, again, not an apple is an apple. You have to figure out how do you make these work. So the current provision as it exists would allow a person to come back and work up to 100 months. Here's the thing. If you retire from state government, you can go wherever you want in the private sector and get 100% of the benefit that you've earned at the time of your retirement, and you will earn that until you die, doing whatever you want if you're not working for the state government. That is not changing at all. But as for those folks that would come back into a state government job, the decision was made, what is that threshold? And ultimately it was determined the number 100. We tried to look at, okay, how many hours does the average deputy sheriff work? How many hours does the average substitute, or days does the average substitute teacher teach? How many hours does a school bus driver drive, for example? And we came up with 100 hours per month is fine. You can come back into any government job for 100 hours a month. If you're a teacher, 100 days per year. And that will reset. That's not a one-time thing in your retirement. That's every single month and or year. So if you work 100 hours or less doing anything in a government job, you can pull your entire full pension benefit with no compromise to it whatsoever. If you work more than that in a government job, then you would forego that. That affords people the ability to make decisions. It does prevent somebody from going back in and getting another full-time job. There's also depending on the plan, a 1 to 6 month wait period before a person would do that, because some people have historically, this will be a shocker, they queue up a job in advance. Now that may be hard to believe, but people have done it, and fair enough. There was nothing to prevent them from doing it, but all these things have contributed to some of the problems that we now have. Not because somebody did something illegal or nefarious or intentionally wrong, but it nonetheless did contribute. So that is why for teachers, 100 days, there are 185 days in this school year, I think, right? So 100 days, you'd be able to teach better than a half a year as a substitute teacher. So if you're filling in for somebody who's on maternity leave, or you're filling in for somebody who's on sick leave, or you're just filling in, from time to time, a couple days a week, 2-3 days a week, You'll be able to do that just fine with 100 days a week, and you can do that every year, as many years as you want, and still pull your full benefit, dialing that up or down as you want. We've tried to accommodate for this for exactly the reasons you raised, because it's a very valid point. And those were, again, things we heard from all these different interest groups that we've talked to. That's why this whole plan did turn out as it is. With respect to the contribution for teachers and whether or not they can contribute to Social Security, and let me say this, and I apologize if it's not the case for those on the stage. I will make whatever time until you're out of questions, within some modicum of reason. But if you have to get up and leave, you're not going to offend me. If you truly have to go and be somewhere, feel free to get up and leave. Some of you didn't come in here expecting to stay for 2 hours plus. You really didn't. So if you have to go, please go. And really, truly, it's not going to offend me, and I hope it offends nobody else. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that I answer questions for those of you who still have them. So you're welcome to stay. And I mean it sincerely. I just realized we're probably well over when we were intending to be here. But I'll continue to stay and answer these questions. The second part of your question is as it relates to Social Security for teachers. I heard when I was running time and time again, well, teachers don't get to participate in Social Security. So we have to have this more generous plan and this benefit, et cetera. And that was a good argument. And in fact, when I first put my proposal forward, it absolutely had all teachers moving to Social Security. Because people said, hey, not only do I not get to participate myself, but frankly, if my spouse passes away and I'm a widowed teacher or a widower or whatever, I don't get the benefit of their, even if they had a good Social Security income. Those are true and valid points. So we intentionally, initially in the first round of what we did, we put in a plan that allowed Social Security for teachers. But then we heard outrage because we kept, over the course of this, we'd go back and we'd talk to people like the KEA. We talk to people like JCTA and the people who employ the vast majority of teachers in our state who are members of these organizations. They were outraged. They said, we don't want to be in Social Security. We said, what? That's not what we're hearing from the membership. They're saying we don't. We have letters they wrote on their letterhead representing all these teachers saying, don't put us into Social Security. So that's why we took it back out again. You know, there's always someone who wants this and someone who's not. But the people who speak for those, if you pay dues for someone to speak for you, then I assume they're speaking for you. So that's why we took it out. The important thing to understand, and we'll come back to what that means or doesn't mean for a teacher who is or is not able to participate in Social Security. But interestingly, if you go, there are 11 states, I believe, right now who don't allow teachers or some employees to contribute into Social Security. Once you go, you can never go back. Ever. So this is not off the table for it as a future consideration, but based on more reaction against it than for it, we decided in this bill not to put it in now. Not to put it in now. Doesn't mean we couldn't at some future point, if there suddenly became more voices who wanted teachers to participate in Social Security than who didn't, and it reversed from where it is now, we could always do that as a state. But once we as a state go there ever one time, for one employee, you can't do it for just new employees and not for old ones. If you do it for a single teacher, you do it for every teacher now and forevermore. That's why we have to be very thoughtful about it.
Well, just a clarification on my second question. Would this be more expensive than fixing the entire system as it is right now? Because the thought process...
Would which be more expensive? I do want to understand.
Would potentially be more expensive than just using a shared responsibility approach to fix the system that we currently have.
Again, forgive me for, and I'm not understanding you, but I'm going to ask you to clarify this. Would what be more expensive? Going to Social Security?
Would going to a defined contribution with the level of benefit offered in your proposal cost the state more than fixing the existing defined contribution pension program that we have?
Well, we don't have a defined contribution program now. We have a defined benefit program.
Sorry, I reversed those.
Okay.
Would going to a defined contribution system as proposed be more expensive than continuing in a defined benefit
for future
it up for the future?
For future employees, and you all heard the question. The question is, why are we doing this for future? Because if we don't make structural changes, without question, the cost to taxpayers into the future, 30 years and beyond, will be less under defined contribution. No question. That's why we're doing it. The system will fail. If we stay on the path we're on, for the reasons we talked about earlier, it will fail. There is no capacity financially to keep pace with that when you have an inverted curve like wedge like that. You just can't. And so because of that, of course, it will be cheaper. But this is why we took even a teacher who is in their first year and give them all the way to 27 years under the existing plan. No change whatsoever. Everything that they thought they were going to get. The only thing that starts to change, anyone who's eligible to retire, anything that they thought they would have in the next 5 years, if you're eligible, and about 25% of our teachers are currently eligible to retire. If anything they were anticipating coming down the pike in the next 5 years in their life, financially, has not changed. Nothing. They can still retire with their high 3. They can still use every sick day and every other day that they've accrued, vacation days, etc. They can still roll those in and use those towards spiking their pension. They can do all those things. They can do all of that with no change until 2023. So all the concern and the fear, and you hear people, there's going to be a mass exodus. No, there won't. Only if people are financially intending to harm themselves, which 99.9% of sane, rational people do not do. And teachers are among the most educated and aware of anybody. And they're quite capable between now and July 1st of next year, when this would start to affect anybody, of figuring out the fact that there's no incentive to retire early. Quite the opposite. After 2023, then yes, if somebody starts to accrue a retirement benefit after 2023 as a teacher, and I'm sticking to teachers simply because you're a superintendent and asked it for them. For somebody beyond 2023, they would move into a defined contribution plan. That is one where they would make a contribution and the state would make a contribution. But it is a very generous one because teachers, even then, unless something changes between now and then, will not have Social Security. Because they don't, they have a much more generous match in that plan than any other state worker does in theirs under this proposal. And some go, well, that's not fair. Well, it's very fair because others get to contribute. Now, here's the important thing to understand. Other people who do contribute to Social Security, and those of you who do so, how many in this room contribute to Social Security? Okay, almost everybody. So you know that, what is it, 6-point-some-odd% of every one of your paychecks goes to paying Social Security. Guess how much teachers pay out of their paycheck? 0. But you know why? Because they get 0 in return. So we would be asking them to contribute under a defined contribution plan, something to their own benefit, but the state matching it as well. But they would never pay that 6-point-some% to Social Security. They'd never get anything in return. There is still, and this is important to understand, there's still the absolute possibility between now and any time in the future of the state deciding to put teachers into Social Security. We could do it at some point. Right now, more don't want it than want it. And that's why it's not in this plan. But the day that comes that Kentucky puts even a single teacher in, every teacher from that point on and forevermore will always be in Social Security. So that hopefully that answers your question. Yes, sir. And then over here.
You said that there wouldn't be any change to the benefit in the next 5 years, but is there not a cap on Social Security earnings for the maximum payout?
For Social Security earnings?
Yes.
127.
For 127,000? Yeah, there is.
So there would be a...
There would be for a handful of people, true. And frankly, superintendents among them would be likely to feel some response to that. Yes. 120 for anybody who pulls a retirement benefit for the rest of their life of $127,000 a year or more, which is a very small percentage. And with all due respect, if you happen to be one or you happen to be one, 99% of the people in Kentucky think that's higher than it should be. Whether you feel that you've earned it or not, and you have, and nobody's questioning that, but that would cap that you would not in the state of Kentucky retire earning for the rest of your life more than $127,000 a year at the expense of all your fellow taxpayers for the rest of your life. That is true. That would change.
The other question is, what about the actuarial scoring? When will the...
We should have some of it this week. It's been getting scored repeatedly along the way, as you could imagine. Because when you first come up with something, and it keeps changing. And so when it was announced, we realized if we don't make an announcement, then we're never going to have something definitive that we can get the final score on. It takes 7 to 10 weeks, or 7 to 10 days, I should say, to score something. We've already gotten a commitment. We should have some of the scores back as early as Thursday this week. The only ones that have not, there's 2 different actuaries. The teachers have their own. They're a little slower in responding. They have not committed yet. It shouldn't take them. We've already given them so many iterations of the same thing. And if people intentionally try to slow walk it, then we cannot withstand the requirement to have it. It would be irresponsible and foolish of us not to have it, the score. But we know roughly what it's going to be. We already do because we've scored them along the way. They just have changed. And everything that might change, including the small changes that will come even as a result of conversations like this and that our legislators are having, also have the ability to change it a bit. But we want to have at least a pretty clear idea so that when folks go in to vote on it, they know what the actual financial impact is. We'll have the bulk of the plans, everything but the teacher's plan. I'm pretty confident we'll have Thursday, and hopefully we'll have that by then too. Yes, sir.
Governor, it's a pleasure to see you, and it's always our pleasure to have you share some of the wisdom that you have on this topic here in Owensboro.
You're kind.
And to you and to Senator Bowen, who grabbed what's been the third rail of Kentucky politics as hard as you could and run with it. It takes like guts, and we know that it's not easy. We're thankful to have leaders that are willing to take on tough topics and are willing to take criticism when that comes. With that, I guess I look forward to vigorous debate on this bill to make it better, because I believe our legislative process does that and bears that out. So a couple of ideas that I might be able to throw out, and then I want to discuss one possible unintended consequence that I hope we're all thinking about that has to do with economic development. One, as far as the limitation on retired workers being able to come back and work, is there a reason why that worker who came back could not pay into the system but not draw out of it the second time?
That's in there.
Well, I mean, if they came back, if there was no limitation, not the 100 days, not the 100 hours,
Right.
and said, I'm going to pay, if I were a first-time employee, what I would have paid, adding to the number of people who are paying into the system, but subtracting from the number of people who are taking out, because the second time they came in.
No, it is in there, but only up to the 100 days and or 100 hours. And your argument is that why not let them have unlimited ability to do that?
Yeah.
It's a fair question, and I think the decision, and I don't mean to cut you off, it's only just so I don't have the same problem where I forget what the next 2 or 3 things you're going to say are going to be, so let me just address this one real quickly, and that is the decision was made we will make this threshold. We'll see what impact it has on substitute teachers and school bus drivers and deputy sheriffs, and if in fact there's nothing set in stone about this. And so your argument that something could be made better, it very well could be. This 100 days, 100 hours might be exactly right. It might be too much. It may be too little. If it's too little, then future legislative action, we could fix it as early as the top of the year. But I think the key is we'll know in a couple years, or probably within the first year, whether that's the right number or not as people start to retire.
Because I think you want as many people paying into the system but not taking out as you can, right? And so the more retirees you have paying in but not double dipping on a second pension, and that shorts up the system.
But it's also, bear in mind, and not to beat this to death, but in fairness, and this is for those in law enforcement, those in other areas as well, it is a competitive advantage for a person who already has a full benefit in health care. They come in and are more attractive than a person who has none of the above. They have no job and they have no health care. And you can pay this person actually a little bit more, the retired person, who's already got a full pension from the taxpayer and full benefits of health from the taxpayer, or at least some portion of it that they were willing to retire based on. And they are now able to be paid maybe even a little bit more, or maybe a little less, or maybe the same. But either way, no matter which of them it is, they're more financially affordable to that county or city than the person who needs a job and health care. And so it is a balancing act. Where do you actually ostracize people who need jobs and an opportunity to get health care themselves, who also could be qualified? I mean, that's where we're trying to split that as best we can. So, sorry.
Yeah, and I see that. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that leads to kind of the unintended consequence I want to make sure that we're thinking about. And we'll think about it from the education side, because, again, that seems to be the main topic. The unintended consequence that I'm worried about is if we move to a defined contribution plan such as a 401k, and let's say the federal government caps the tax deducted amount that you can give into that 401k, and so we move people into that system, which I think generally most of us who that's all we can get is 401ks kind of thing. It seems fair. But it also means that our school systems are going to have to start competing on wages instead of so much on benefits. And so the communities that have larger population centers like Owensboro will win in that we can we can afford more for a teacher than a rural community. My concern is what that means for our rural communities is that they won't be able to have access to the kind of education that we can have in other parts of the state as we compete more on wages. And what's that going to mean as far as training our workforce for those economic development opportunities? Will we be able to say, Kentucky has a great broad-based workforce for you that we educated, or are we going to end up 30, 40 years from now saying, we've got 5 or 6 really great communities where you can do things because we had a great education system in those communities, but not in the others. That's and not to knock it and say that it's not worth trying to fix this problem because this problem is dire. It's just one of those unintended consequences I want to make sure that we're thinking about could happen as we compete on wages.
So let me touch on that real quick. I think you all could hear the question. Thank you for speaking up clearly. The question is about what unintended consequences might happen as it relates to, if you have a less generous retirement benefit, then maybe it's harder to attract people into a rural community or some areas where the monies to pay them or not is readily available. And what unintended consequences might come as a result of that. It is certainly a worthy thing to think about and potentially be concerned about, but I would submit 2 things for you. We already have tremendous disparity in terms of quality of education between our urban and rural communities. And the irony is it's not as simply the function of the cities with the most money have the best education. 15% of our public education students, our K through 12 students, 15% of them are in Jefferson County. 50% of the failing schools in our state are in Jefferson County. It's not for lack of money. They spend more money per student than any other school district in the state. I'm pretty confident in that. So given that, it isn't purely a function of whether you have money for it. It just isn't. There's not, money alone is not the answer. However, you do raise a valid point. We are not competitive in terms of the wages we pay our teachers, our law enforcement officers, our prison guards, our social workers. Pick one. I don't mean just nationally. I mean relative to the people right around us where someone could go across a river. That's not lost on me. I'm the first governor. Again, I did this in the face of having cuts where I got to be despised by everybody, in putting more money into a pension system where, ironically, I'm being despised by the people whose money I'm putting in for them. But I did this at the same time as making wage increases for law enforcement officers, social workers, prison guards. Do I wish we could do them for everyone else and even more? Of course. Is it my intent in time to do so as we can? Yes. There were certain areas where they literally, transportation workers, another one, they hadn't seen a wage in 10 years, wage increase. Is moving them from $9 an hour to 13 still kind of almost an insult? Yeah, but it's a whole lot better than $9.50 to $13.50. Those are things I've done already, even in the face of having to cut and try to find things. It's not lost on me. Again, I say this not to, it's no different than a lot of people in this room. As I said earlier, I grew up from a numerical standpoint, in abject poverty. I was blessed to have a mother and father who at least came home every night, and I'll tell you, not every kid has that luxury. But from a financial standpoint, I know what it's like to have no money. I grew up right near the Canadian border in a house with no central heat. Literally. One winter, the septic line froze. We had no plumbing the entire winter. We never had a shower. I say all this not to wah, but the reality is there's a lot of people in Kentucky who live that way even now to some degree. I know that world. It was the first half of my life. I am more than sympathetic. I am empathetic to the need to provide opportunities for people. But it goes back to everything we've talked about. It has to be paid for. Somehow, somewhere, you can't just promise it, you can't just give it and hope the next guy pays for it. That's how we've gotten into this situation. That's wrong. It's irresponsible. It's immoral. To give somebody a false promise is a lie, and that's wrong. I'm not going to do it. So to that end, I recognize we need to increase. The way you keep that imbalance and that hypothesis that you put out there from happening is to get our financial house in order. And the question this woman asked earlier about the economic impact and how you grow jobs and create an environment, we've got to get our house in order financially to attract people to want to pick us over in Indiana or whoever, so that those people employ here, pay the taxes here, buy goods and services here, pay property taxes here, use services here, contribute to these communities instead of ones across the river. And if in fact we do that, and I believe we can do that, that's how we ultimately have more revenue to be able to do things like pay higher increases to all the aforementioned positions. We ultimately have to. That's not lost on me. I'm a private sector person. I've been blessed in my life. I've lived the American dream. I've seen how you can go from one end of the socioeconomic spectrum to the other. I'm grateful for that. But I don't forget how I got from one end to the other. And the reality is you need an environment in which opportunity exists. This is what I'm trying to create for Kentucky. This is why I'm committed to this. This is why I was willing to do this job, is to create an environment in which we have a financial foundation solid enough to be able to make these kind of raises, not on hypothesis that someday somebody down the road will figure out how to pay for it, but because we actually have money to pay for it. Indiana 15 years ago was in worse financial shape than us in many respects. Bigger deficits, bigger problems. They have billion-dollar surpluses. They do pay people more because they can afford to. They didn't 15 years ago. The reality is we can do this too. With all due respect to everybody in Illinois and Tennessee and Indiana and Ohio and West Virginia and Missouri and whoever else borders us. Tennessee, all of them. With all due respect to every one of them. We have as good or better than them on just about every front. We really do. We may not be better than everybody around us on everything, but we have unbelievable competitive advantages. We're right in the middle of all the above. Seasonally, meteorologically, logistically, with roadways, riverways, and railways that transect through here, we have as good or better than anybody. How can we not be taking advantage of the things that those around us have been eating our lunch at our expense on? We can and we will. But you have to start by getting your house in order. You bet I'd like to see people. I'll tell you what, and this is, you know who doesn't have a voice? We have spent a lot of time talking about teachers, and I'm glad that we have. We talk a lot about law enforcement, and I'm glad that we have. You know who has no voice? The person who literally fears for their life that walks into a home to remove a child. We as a state have done a crappy job of taking care of a lot of different constituencies. And the irony is, some of those that we've taken the crappiest care of are the people who have no voice. They don't have lobbyists and advocacy groups and well-oiled, machines creating chain letters for people and encouraging people to send out information, some true and some not, and how to call a 1-800 number. I would encourage any one of you, if you've never been into your local DCBS office, go into your local DCBS office. Spend 1 minute, let alone an hour or a day, talking to the men and women who go in there and work on behalf of the most vulnerable people in our communities. We pay them diddly. We don't pay them close. Go talk to a prison guard. You look at what we pay people. The comment was made earlier about how some people, I think it was in this session, about how some teachers are paid so poorly that they literally could qualify in some instances for social benefits. And while that's true, it's far more true for a whole lot of other people who do critical, important jobs and who are lost and have no voice. Who's fighting for them? Who's fighting for them? Nobody. Nobody is. It's not acceptable. What other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm a retired kindergarten teacher, so excuse my level of sophistication. But I have asked this question repeatedly in emails that I have sent, not through a welfare system, but through my own. Why are we tackling pension reform before tax reform? It seems like the reverse would make more sense.
The question is, why are we tackling pension reform before tax reform? If you have a hole to fill in, would you start throwing dirt in the hole before you knew how big it was? If you had to order fill, you had to order X number of dump trucks or X number of yards of material, would you just start throwing stuff in a hole before you knew how big the hole was? Probably not. There's nobody who has anything of that sort in a physical sense that would do that. It would be completely irresponsible for us to start throwing money at a problem when we don't even know what the problem is. We absolutely have to figure out the size and scope of the problem. Once we know what it is, as I mentioned earlier, even if we pass this bill exactly as it's been proposed, the cost to our state is significantly more than it's ever been. The $1.2 billion we put in is going to go up by hundreds of millions more. It will be at least a couple $2 billion a year. Where's that money going to come from? Of course, as we said earlier, it's going to come from tax revenue. Has to. But the idea of just throwing money in a hole, you don't even know how deep the hole is. You don't even know if there's a bottom in the hole. That would be unbelievably irresponsible. Incredibly irresponsible. We have to know the size and scope of what we're dealing with so that once it is quantified, we know exactly what now has to be done on the tax front and or whatever else. There's no way we can cut our way out of this. There's not. It's not possible. We cannot cut enough out of state government to pay this obligation that is owed. Not possible. Which means it's going to have to come from a combination of things. And we will have a much clearer, literally definitive understanding of exactly what that is, when in fact we've codified that number. That's why. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is the Social Security growth as well?
That's, I'm not counting on getting anything out of Social Security, but that's just me. I mean, that's a whole nother topic of conversation.
There was a very small percentage of people making over $100,000 retirement. What is that percentage? Because I know I'm on a former school board member.
Yeah.
And you mandated 1% increase for teachers, and that also included administrators. And 55 or 20% got $1,000 or more in their increase in pay, while the majority of teachers split about 213,000, about 1,000 employees. So,
I'm not sure what those numbers you're referring to are. I don't follow you on that, but,
3 years ago.
okay, well, I wasn't around then,
But 100,
so I'm not sure.
maybe your first year.
No, it wasn't me, so I truly don't know what that was, so I can't speak to that. But the question was, how many people are making more than $127,000 a year plus health care? Is Brian in here? Brian, do you happen to know? He doesn't know either. I don't know. I'll get that for you. It's 127 is the cap, so we can, but how many are making 127,000 or more? Not a lot, but there are some. And I'm telling you straight up, there's literally, if you ask 100 out of 100 people, especially if they're also retired state workers, if they think that $127,000 a year for life at the taxpayer expense, no matter what you did to earn it, is enough, 100 out of 100 will say yes. 100 out of 100. You might get one person who's among those few that's getting more than that would say no. Everyone else would say yes. And that's where that number came from. It's unhappy news for the people making more than that, but it is not to everybody else who's paying for it. Other questions of any kind? Yes, ma'am. And then here, the woman in the back and then the woman in orange.
You speak of 127,000 cap. Is that one retirement, or will they double it? Will they be a combined?
That's a good question. I mean, there's even fewer people that double dip. That's a very good question. I don't know. But truth be told, the vast majority of people who double dipped when that was allowed, double dipped on two pensions which combined don't even come close to 127. I mean, you're talking probably a handful of people for whom that would be an issue. I'd have to go back and read through that myself. I don't know that even was brought up. It's really intended to be people who very thoughtfully and intentionally and not illicitly found a way to, trust me, there's a whole lot of people who have historically worked certain jobs and found themselves appointed to certain positions in the last few years so that they could, retire accordingly. And that's part of what has compounded the problems that we have. In the front, yes, ma'am. Yes, you.
Governor, I'm Susan Tierney. I'm the circuit clerk here in Davis County. And a question that I have had from several of my employees and other people that have talked about is the portion of the bill that talks about freezing the sick time come June the 30th, and trying to understand what that means by freezing that. I know they, until that point, they can use it to enhance their retirement as part of their years. So I'm trying to understand what the purpose is in freezing it Does that mean, I mean, they'll still accrue their sick time after that?
Yes, they would use them or cash them in for cash value, but not be able to use it toward the actual spiking of a pension.
So
But-
you're not really freezing it, they're not going to
Correct.
lose them?
No,
they'll
no,
just
no,
freeze
nobody,
it.
anything that's been accrued is still of value. Anything that's been accrued to that point can be used in the way that it was intended. Again, every group is a little bit different. So there's has folks, non-has folks, teachers, they're all a little bit different. For teachers, again, as I said to earlier, between now and 2023, there's zero change. They can accrue and use and spike and do whatever they thought they were going to do for the next 5.5 years. There's no change. But for other state employees after July 1st of 2018, the value of what you've accrued thus far can be used, but you can't add new things to it. You cannot accrue additional sick days and or vacation days or what have you, and then save those up and roll them. And you can use them, and or you can get paid out on them. People get paid out. The value is about 30 cents on the dollar. We're not saying people shouldn't get paid. They should get paid for those. There is value in them, and they should get paid that value.
And then your statement as far as the social workers, I appreciate that, because all of the social workers work, all of the state police work comes into my office, and not only to go to the cabinet, but I would invite anybody to come into my building.
Yeah.
Because I have some very dedicated workers there that are not paid near what they're worth.
They're not, and you're right. And it breaks my heart to see what, and honestly too, it's not even just the dollars, because I've said there's nobody who enters that work who does it for the money. Because frankly, the job that they do, there isn't enough money you could pay someone to do it. There really isn't. But it's dangerous, it's heartbreaking, it's thankless, and we don't pay enough credence to it. We really don't. Is there a question over here? Yes, sir.
Governor, somebody came in the state pension plan late in life when I was 50. I'm not sure I understand. There's talk about 27 years, and how does this 65? I'm unclear.
Depending on when you came in, and some of you are aware, if it's any comfort to you, sir, I don't claim to be an expert on every rule of 87 and 55 and 27 and combinations and tier 1, 2, 3 and all these things in combination. You could put a matrix together that would have about 50 different possibilities, and I don't know which one you are. But depending on when you came in, you, based on a combination of years and age, are then eligible for what you thought you would be in terms of a benefit for the rest of your life. You would be eligible. That is not changing if you're already a state employee. That will not change. So whatever combination of years and or age you were told when you came in will be the case. That's exactly what you will have. If you choose to stay beyond that, and given the fact that you came in later, you probably wouldn't. But if you did, and you could, you would then accrue benefit from that point forward in a defined contribution plan. The important thing for people to understand, people often talk about a defined contribution plan as if it has no value. It is much more valuable. We're going to offer even teachers who are coming in the beginning, and going forward, teachers will be required to. The only people that will be not required to be in a defined contribution plan going forward will be hazard duty folks. And people have debated and could debate all that all they want. But the point is, people who literally put a uniform on and know that they might get killed in the line of doing their job, the rest of us should appreciate that to a pretty fair degree. So given that, they are the ones who are still in the forward-looking years, given the opportunity to hire new people into a defined benefit program. They're now 25 years that they would be eligible. However, we are going to make available to them the ability to go into a defined contribution plan rather than a DB plan. I will tell you, as a person who has spent decades in this world and understand it to a degree, while I don't claim to be any expert, I understand it fairly well, which is part of why I ran here. But the fact is, I would take the DC plan in a heartbeat, because it is going to allow a person not only the flexibility, not only the ability to be portable, but it would allow a person to come in at any point in time. You might come in as a law enforcement person, want to spend 10, 12 years, and then go start a business. You might come in as a teacher, spend 10, 12 years, and decide you want to go work for a nonprofit or start a business or whatever the case might be. You'd have that ability. You'd have that portability and that flexibility. And frankly, you'll be able to save more money, which accrues over time. And then again, it doesn't end when you die and or your spouse dies. You could accrue the same amount of money if you start out and work 30 years under the proposed DC plan versus the proposed DB plan, the existing one, using the same assumptions in terms of rate of return for each plan. You would end up with a similar amount of money accrued on your behalf at the end of which you would pull down a benefit of, using an average person as an example, of several $1,000s a month. And that several $1,000s a month, rather than ending when you die, under a DC plan, would still be there. You'd be eating into the growth of that, maybe into the corpus, but the vast majority of that, hundreds of thousands of dollars in value, would still exist, assuming you got the same rate of return that you needed to get to make the other promise come true. You'd have hundreds of thousands of dollars that if you then die and your spouse dies could go to your children or your estate or to some charitable contribution that you had put in your will. A DC plan is a much better plan. It just is. People are afraid of it because they don't understand it. But it is a generous plan, and the contributions that are proposed to be made are better than any that exist in the vast majority of private sector opportunities. So this argument that we won't be able to attract good people to work, nonsense. Relative to a similar job in the private sector, we will. And ultimately, if we do get to the point where we pay people more commensurate with what they do, not only relative to what is done in other states, but just in general, we also will be very competitive. And we will be those things. We can't afford not to be. So I would say for you, I wouldn't worry about that. Final question. I think we're sort of petering out. People, you're just struggling for questions now. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you'll be able to hear me.
I'll repeat it, though. I'll hear you.
I am a retired teacher. I retired in 2007, and I had a very small 503B or whatever the equivalent is.
403B.
In of 2008, we know what happened.
Yep.
And I saw that literally drop to about half of its value. I really am worried about the incoming teachers when they don't have any other income. And I would have probably had to go back to work at that point if everything I had invested had done that. So I wanted to know, that I'm still having trouble with this because of that uncertainty and no guarantee. And I want to know who's managing the money then, because some, right now all of our money is managed by the same people. But I've made some pretty bad decisions with my money, so when I'm in charge of that, I could still end up in trouble, even if the market doesn't fall.
The question is, and it's a valid concern, it's more of a concern, but with some questions associated with if somebody is a new teacher or a new anybody as a state employee, and they come in and they make a contribution into the defined contribution plan, and they're not, somebody who's an expert in investing, and they're not somebody who has that level of understanding, it's possible they could make a mistake. And she made mention of the fact that even if you made mistakes, trust me, people who are very sophisticated and knowledgeable investors still lost half their money when the markets fell in 2008, 2009. No question about it. But it's interesting that what happened is a lot of people who were less sophisticated didn't understand it. They panicked. They took the money out. And they said, well, if that's going to happen, I'm just going to put it into like a cash bearing account. Well, what have interest rates done in the last 10 years? They've been bupkis. In reality, if that same money that fell by 50% had been left alone, it would be worth 2 to 3 times what it was before it fell by 50%. That's what markets do. They do this. If you panic and react, and that's why for long-term investments, the question you asked is a good one. Who makes these decisions? In reality, one of the problems we've had is that it isn't the same people who manage all the state. All the state plans are all different. And some of them have been horrifically run. And the people who've been making decisions as the trustees of those plans have been grossly incompetent. Grossly incompetent. Some with good intentions, some maybe not. I don't know. I don't know them all. But I'm just telling you the result of things. We're one of only a couple of states that actually invested in one Ponzi scheme where we lost $17 million of taxpayers' money. We're one of the least transparent states ever. It's what has always outraged me. You don't even know who's running the money. You don't know how much they're being paid. You don't know who gets paid a finder's fee for them to get hired. You don't know who that person is. That's nonsense. That should not be the case. And the reality is we have different investments all over the place. We're invested in all sorts of things, many of which are very illiquid. And that means you can't get your money back when you want to get your money back. And we should have known those things going in. And some of those things are absolutely in the tank. So the real question you ask in the heart of it is, what about that person who doesn't get all this, doesn't speak this language, doesn't live in that world, and because they're an expert in X, Y, and Z, they're a teacher of this or that, or they're a lawyer of this or that, or they're a law enforcement of this or that, they don't have time to become an expert in investments? Fair enough. What's to make sure a person like that actually has something at the end? That's really the crux of your question, and it's a fair one. You asked who would manage these defined contribution plans. The initial thought is, are you involved in the deferred comp plan? Did you ever participate? 30-some% of all state employees participated in it to some degree. Yeah, so the initial thought would be, but here's what's understood. At the same time that you saw that happen in your DC or deferred comp component, the same thing happened in your defined benefit component, which is part of why we are where we are. It's invested in the very same market, very often in the very same investments. One is more transparent to you than the other. Both took it on the chin. By staying in, you have the ability to come back out again. And all of this is perpetuated on multiple people paying in, this being kind of a long-term into perpetuity type of an investment. The question about who would manage it, initially the thought would be that the same people, and I don't even know who it is. I think it's Nationwide. Does that sound familiar? Nationwide. I think Nationwide, which happens to be a company that does this, doesn't matter who it is. Chances are when we go to this will, every time they would do it, these things are bid out. They would bid, Fidelity would bid, Invesco would bid, whoever. I mean, any of the American funds, whoever. I mean, different people would have the ability to compete for this. Whoever got it would be the ones. It would be incumbent upon them to provide retirement education counselors. And really the most responsible thing people can do is invest in what are called life cycle funds. So somebody who's 25 years old and starting out would be invested with a different set of funds and a different time horizon than someone who's 55. And as you get from 25 to 30 to 35 to 40 to 45 and on up, it would shift and the adjustments would be made by people who do this for a living, who are professional. And it would be done in the form of mutual funds and ETFs and things of this sort. So no individual is going to be asked to, nor would it be prudent of them to be picking stocks. It just wouldn't, or trying to figure out how they're going to invest. Now, they would have the ability to do that if they wanted to. They wouldn't be precluded from having some autonomy, but the smartest among them and the most long-term minded among them would defer that to someone else whose full focus that is. And so it would be probably Nationwide initially, just because they currently they're in such a relationship with the state for 30-some% of all our employees already. And that would probably be the same. But then as it would grow, people, and here's the other thing too, people also have the ability to make choices and move things. You can port, especially if a person leaves, they can roll it into the IRA of their own choosing, an independent, an individual IRA, or they could roll it into a 401k plan of another company that they might, become a part of, or even another system that they might be a part of. If they became a teacher, for example, in another state or something, there's value associated with it, then it's portable. And that happens, regularly with millions and millions of people in America. So the intent is to provide people with more flexibility and more capability, to not leave them hanging. One of my brothers who used to be a public school teacher is now actually a retirement education counselor. He actually helps people with exactly this issue. So he's been a teacher his whole life in the school system and outside of the school system. But he has for some years been a retirement education counselor and literally helps people in public service and people outside of public service figure out how they should invest depending on where they are in their life cycle and what their expectation is when they retire. He's an example of the kind of person who does this. There are many of them, and all these different companies that manage money employ these different people. He's had the same job and worked for 4 different companies over the time, because I think he works for Transamerica now or something. But
anticipating the same percentage of money that teachers pay now going into that.
It'll be more generous, actually, in some measure. The DC plan will allow them to save 18% of what they are earning. I think that's right. Don't me if I'm wrong.
I mean, if the federal government limits it.
Well, again, the question was, and I don't know if you or somebody asked the question, I didn't touch on that. If there's I don't have a crystal ball, but here's what I know. The only thing, the federal government is not good at taking anything away. We've seen that in pretty good measure on a lot of fronts. They're good at giving, they're not good at taking away. I don't see that happening. The only thing I've heard that even has any modicum of credibility is the idea that would require everybody to be in a Roth IRA as opposed to what was a choice of a traditional. A traditional allows you to put put money in tax deferred. A Roth allows you to take it out tax deferred or tax exempt. And that's the only thing I've heard, and I wouldn't even lay good odds on the fact that that'll ever happen. But if it did, that's the only thing I've heard anywhere at a federal level that's being talked about changing the system. And truth be told, that's for the beneficiary of the person, assuming they actually live to retirement when they will need it. It is to their advantage. It's better to take the money out, tax deferred. And then it really is. Again, it's a sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I wouldn't bet that's going to happen. That's the only thing I've even heard that anybody's talked about in recent time. Thank you all very much. I appreciate those of you who have stayed in particular. You're patient and kind. Maybe you were just being gracious because you sat up front and didn't want to leave me hanging. But thank you one way or the other. I appreciate the questions, and thank you for the interest. And the last thing I'll say is this. Get the actual information. Get the actual things that have been said and the things that haven't been said. Don't rely on hearsay. There's too much of it. Even one of the questions that was asked was in insinuating a comment that if you read the Herald Leader. The comment that was made was an absolute fabrication. Read the comment in its entirety. The comment that I made about sophistication of people, and it goes back to the social workers, among others, that I'm talking about. I said the people that are going to be the most affected by this are the least financially sophisticated. And the exact words, you can look them up for yourself. The headline is not what I said. I didn't say anything about the sophistication of teachers, which is what the headline said. Not at all. And as a teacher, somebody who understands the veracity of what is actually on the page, I would ask you and a whole lot of other people to look for the truth, the actual truth, not someone's twist on it, not someone's play on it, not someone's misinterpretation of it. There was one of your colleagues, hang on one second, I'll tell you his name. One of your colleagues just today sent out another superintendent, and not the head of the superintendents, a gentleman by the name of David Pencil. He's a superintendent in I'm not sure where he is. He's in Rockcastle County. Literally sent out a letter today to people saying, quoting me, and again, this is an educator. This is a person who should understand and appreciate and respect the fact that when you put something in quotes, that more than implies that that was what was actually said. This is what it said. It says, the governor stated yesterday, doesn't imply that I insinuate, it says, governor stated yesterday that, quote, opponents of the pension plan do not have the sophistication to know what's at stake, end quote. That is a 100% lie. 100% lie. Not only is it not what I said, it's not even what I was quoted as having said. But people who want to believe lies will believe lies. And they'll take things and they'll impute them into being something else. They'll take a word like sophistication. That is a very appropriate word. There are people who are legally sophisticated and those who are not. There are people that are financially sophisticated and those who are not. There are people that are educationally sophisticated and those that are not. It isn't to impugn someone's lack of intelligence. It has everything to do with whether or not they're sophisticated on a particular topic. And the comment that I did make, which is very true, is that the vast majority of people who are affected by a failing system do not understand what's at stake. They don't. That's not to insult them. That is a reality. The average person on the street, including somebody who is in the system, does not understand even the difficulty that this state has if our credit rating falls. They couldn't, with truth serum, tell you who the credit rating agencies are that govern the credit rating for a state. These are people, some of whom have PhDs and are brilliant people. Has nothing to do with their intelligence. This is not an area of expertise. And if you don't have expertise in an area, you wouldn't want me in a hostage situation being the guy that goes in. You'd want one of these guys. I would be the absolute wrong person to send in there. One of these guys would be the right person. But what's critical and what you owe yourselves, as well as everybody who's involved in trying to find a solution, is to look at the facts. Don't trust what your emotion wants you to believe. Don't believe the boogeyman that someone tells you is the boogeyman. As intelligent, educated, thoughtful people, look at the actual source. And if somebody's lying to you, you shouldn't perpetuate that. You shouldn't impugn that, and you shouldn't spread that around. You just shouldn't. It's disingenuous. It does not help the cause. And it creates a faction among people, and it creates a dissension in the ranks that doesn't help us. It does not help us fix this problem, and we have to fix the problem. So thank you. I appreciate you being here. Stay tuned and expect us to do what you elected us to do, which is to fix this problem. Thank you very much.